Hi, welcome back to our lecture. This is Jason Baker, and I'm continuing to talk about pipelines and using a Jenkins server and the pipeline DSL to create our pipelines. So far, when we've been building projects within Jenkins and we've been building pipelines, we've been focusing on software builds. And that's probably the most common use case for a pipeline to build and test and automate the deployment of software applications. But we can also use pipelines to automate the creation and testing and deployment of infrastructure as well. We call these infrastructure pipelines. And in my organization, we have quite a few pipelines that are dedicated to building infrastructure. And there's sort of two general use cases. Uh, One is that we can build an infrastructure pipeline to test infrastructure before we actually deploy it. And the second use case is to automate the deployment of infrastructure and then the deployment of our software platform on top of that infrastructure. Let me give you kind of a brief outline of what an infrastructure pipeline might look like. And this is an infrastructure pipeline using cloud formation. So you have, let's say you've created a cloud formation template. That template defines a stack of infrastructure resources. And what you want to do is you want to create a pipeline which will automatically, anytime you make a change to the CloudFormation stack, it will automatically build that stack, and then it might perform some tests to make sure that the resources in the stack are configured properly. So a pipeline, an infrastructure pipeline like this might start out by, of course, cloning the Git repo where the CloudFormation template lives. And then the pipeline might perform a linting process to lint the CloudFormation template to verify that the template contains valid CloudFormation syntax. Then the pipeline would perform a deployment of the CloudFormation template. So it would create a test stack, and it would wait for the template creation to complete. Once the template creation completes, then the pipeline would test the AWS resources to verify that the correct resources were installed and that they're all configured and working together properly. Once those tests pass, then the pipeline would terminate the that CloudFormation stack and remove all of those AWS resources. And then finally, it would publish the new CloudFormation template to some sort of artifact repository. Could be an S3 bucket, or it could be something like a Nexus artifact repository. That's kind of the basic outline for how an infrastructure template would or infrastructure pipeline would work. Again, we can test our infrastructure this sort of the same way we test our software applications, and we can use Jenkins and the pipeline DSL to test infrastructure for us. So let's kind of walk through a very simple example of how this might work in Jenkins. Now, one thing that you need to keep in mind is that if Jenkins is going to build AWS infrastructure, then it needs access to the AWS API. And in order to access the API, it's going to need AWS credentials, right? So we need to set up an account that Jenkins will use within our AWS account. And then we need to take the credentials from that account, the API key and the secret key, and we can store those then within the Jenkins credential store. Once they're stored in Jenkins, then those credentials can be made available to projects that need to build and orchestrate AWS infrastructure. So let's look and see how we might go about doing that. I would start out by going into Identity Access Management in my AWS account. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to the user section and add a new user. I'm just going to call this user Jenkins. And this is going to be a user that has programmatic access to my account. And say next permissions. I'm going to give this account a power user access, which is probably more than a typical Jenkins account would need. But for educational purposes, I think this is okay. And then I say next review, and I'm going to go ahead and create this user. Now, of course, it gives me the access key and the secret access key information. I can show that here. I'm going to leave this page up, and then because I need to be able to copy this information into Jenkins. So now I'm going to go back into Jenkins and into my Jenkins server. And what I need to do is I need to I'm going to go to the main dashboard page. And I'm going to click on the credentials link and click on, let's see, I'm going to click on my Jenkins store. And I'm going to click on the global credentials domain. And here you can see I have my existing GitHub token. So Jenkins has this secure credential store where you can store any kind of credential that might be needed by a step within a pipeline. I'm going to go ahead and add more credentials, and there is an AWS credential type. So I'm going to select that type, and it's going to be, let's see, I'm going to give it a description, which will be AWS credentials. I can specify an ID if I want to. I'm going to say Jenkins-AWS. And then my access key is going to be copied from the IAM site. And then my secret access key will be copied from IAM as well. And then I can simply click OK. And now there is an AWS credential, which is stored in the secure credential store. And now that it's in there, I can make use of it in a pipeline. So let's go ahead and create a new project. We'll go back to the Jenkins dashboard, and we're going to create a new pipeline project called AWS-test pipeline project. Select OK. And this pipeline project isn't going to use a Git repository. And normally we would put like a Jenkins file in the Git repository. We're just not going to use it for this particular pipeline. So what we want this pipeline to do is something that's very simple. We want this pipeline to exercise the AWS CLI, and we want it to run a CloudFormation command to describe all of the stack resources in our Jenkins stack. Now, if you named your CloudFormation stack something else, if other than Jenkins, then you just substitute that name in this particular command. So I'm going to scroll down here, and we're going to use a pipeline script. I'm going to copy and paste this pipeline script in here. And it's important to note that we're selecting the Linux node. That's one of the slave nodes, and that node has the AWS CLI command installed on it. So it will be able to run the AWS CLI. And we're telling it to run this CloudFormation command, list all the resources in the Jenkins stack. Again, if your stack is named something other than Jenkins, then you would change this name here. And so let's go ahead and save this and go ahead and build it and see what happens. So it's building. Oop, and it failed. So this pipeline failed. Let's click on the build number and look at console output and try to figure out what's going on here. So it's trying to run this command, AWS CloudFormation command, and it says an error occurred. User is not authorized to perform CloudFormation described stack resources. So for some reason, the user is not able to perform that or access that API method. So what's going on here? Well, just because we added the credentials, the AWS credentials to the Jenkins credential store doesn't actually mean that Jenkins is going to use those credentials in this particular project. So we have to explicitly configure within our pipeline script, we have to specify that Jenkins should use the AWS credentials when it's running this AWS CloudFormation command. And the way we do that is we can use the with credentials pipeline command. If I go back into my project page, then I can click on pipeline syntax, and I'm going to specify the with credentials command. So let's see, here we go, with credentials. So I want to run the with credentials command, and I want to use, I'm going to bind an AWS access key and secret to this credential. And so here's, I've got the AWS credential I've added. It's already selected as a credential. And so now I want to generate. So it generates this snippet of code, and you can see that it's specifying that a set of code, so this block of code should be executed with these particular credentials. So what I need to do is copy this snippet of code, and then I need to go back to my pipeline job and the configuration, go down to my stage where I'm defining the shell command, that AWS CloudFormation command. I'm going to paste in that snippet of code, trying to sort of maintain the indentation. You see, this is the code I need to replace. So I'm going to copy my shell command, copy that, and I need to move it to this position so that it's encapsulated by this with credentials block of code. So now when this pipeline runs, it should run this AWS CloudFormation command with the AWS credentials that I've added into the into the Jenkins credential store. I'm going to go ahead and save that and go ahead and try another build. And this build was successful. So let's take a look at this build output. Click on console output, and there you go. Here is our AWS CloudFormation command, and then here's the output. It's a big JSON object output from this API command, and it was able to successfully run this command because now it's actually passing in the AWS credentials that the pipeline job needs. So here again is sort of the example script. Don't copy and paste this example script. It will not work in your Jenkins environment because it's specific to my environment, but just gives you kind of an idea of how the code is laid out. So wrapping things up on this pipeline lecture and the Jenkins lecture, it's when you're working with these infrastructure projects, it's just like working with a typical software pipeline. You're going to do it sort of in an iterative fashion, and you'll work on the pipeline stage by stage, and you know, in this sort of a pipeline project. Obviously, this is very basic, and it's in this pipeline command is outputting this big JSON object. Typically, what we would do then in the next step of the pipeline is we would actually parse this JSON object and pull out some values from the object, and then use those values in subsequent steps within the pipeline. So this is how you can build, bigger and bigger and more complex infrastructure pipelines, and you can then use an infrastructure pipeline to literally automate almost everything within your AWS environment.